The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a surgical saw cutting through bone. Hannah Clark had worked this exact shift for 3 years, 22 to 6 o'clock, night ICU at Sacred Heart in Norfolk, and the rhythm had become a language only she could read. Monitor beeps. Ventilator wheeze. The soft click of a syringe cap. These were the sounds of her invisibility, the soundtrack of being a nurse who was never quite asked her name. She moved through the ward at 21:11, checking lines and medications on patients who would never remember her face tomorrow. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame that hadn't gained weight since she'd started here, and the combat boots she wore beneath them, Navy-issued, size 7, leather-worn soft as suede in places, were so battered that most people didn't even register they weren't regulation hospital shoes. The boots were the only thing she'd kept from before. From the life she'd walked away from. Nobody here knew what they meant. Nobody here asked. The cold stainless steel of the medication card gleamed under the harsh white light as Hannah pulled up the next patient's chart on the digital screen. Her hands moved with precision, each movement economical, purposeful. She'd learned that way. You didn't waste motion when you were working in sandstorm blackouts with 3 patients on makeshift gurneys and incoming fire making the walls sing. You moved like your hands already knew what they needed to do, and you trusted that knowledge without hesitation. That instinct had never left her, even though she'd tried to leave everything else behind. Clark. The voice came from behind her, Dr. Sterling, making his evening rounds. He pronounced her name like it was a mistake he kept having to correct. Patient in 412 is showing some respiratory decline. Start him on the standard protocol. And try not to deviate from what the actual doctors recommend this time. She turned slowly. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway with a chart under one arm, his white coat pristine, his tie silk. He had the kind of face that looked like it had never doubted anything, handsome in the way money could make handsome, if you had enough of it and few enough scruples. 3 years of working under him had taught her that Sterling didn't see nurses as colleagues. He saw them as extensions of the equipment, tools that occasionally malfunctioned and needed correction. She'd learned to absorb his comments the way the hospital absorbed the smell of antiseptic and old coffee, so completely that she barely noticed it anymore. "I'll monitor closely, Doctor," Hannah said. Her voice came out even, measured. She'd trained it that way. No inflection. No challenge. Just competence delivered quietly enough that it never threatened anyone's sense of hierarchy. The patient's O2 sat has been trending, and I'll watch the trending pattern through the shift. Sterling nodded, already turning away. He didn't need her agreement. He needed her compliance. And she gave it, every single night, because she'd learned that this quiet job at Sacred Heart was the only place where she could breathe without remembering what breathing cost in other places. Places where the sand got into everything and the sounds never stopped, even in the silence. She was reviewing 412's vitals at 23:14 when the ambulance alert came through the intercom. Incoming Marine. Trauma transport from the base. The word Marine made something in her chest tighten in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 2 years. She kept her eyes on the monitor screen. Kept her hand steady on the keyboard. Just a word. Just a patient. She'd handled hundreds of them. The paramedics wheeled him in on a stretcher at 23:41, unconscious, Navy-issue blanket across his chest, and for already running in the left forearm. The trauma team was efficient, professional, getting him into the ICU bay without any of the chaos that outsiders always imagined. One of the paramedics handed off the chart to Sterling, who was already assessing the patient's responsiveness, checking pupils, listening to breath sounds with his stethoscope. Septic shock, the paramedic said. Complications from a field infection that had developed after a training exercise incident. The patient had been brought in unresponsive 3 hours ago. Hannah stood back, watching the team work. Standard protocol. Fluids running. Monitor attached. Lines established. The patient's face was partially turned away from her, obscured by the oxygen mask, but something about the angle of his jaw made her pause. Made her move a step closer, ostensibly to prepare the next medication. She needed to see his face. Needed to not see it. needed to know if the thing her instinct was screaming was real or just the paranoia of someone who'd spent 2 years trying to be invisible. The mask came off for 2 seconds. The paramedic was adjusting the fit. Hannah saw his face fully, and the world didn't stop spinning, it did something worse. It kept moving while she stayed still, watching from a distance as the Marine commander from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, the officer who had led her son's unit in Kandahar, was laid into the bed she would be monitoring all night. His name was Marcus Webb. She'd never told her son that Commander Webb had saved her boy's life. Twice, according to the intelligence briefing she'd read in the deployment records, her son had left on the kitchen table 3 months ago before she'd made him stop bringing work home. Webb had made the calls that kept her son breathing in places where breathing was a privilege. And now he was unconscious in Sacred Heart ICU in Norfolk, and Hannah Clark was the only person who remembered that she wasn't supposed to exist in a place where people like him had once known her name. She moved back to the medication cart. Waited. Watched as Sterling reviewed the chart. The septic shock protocol was straightforward: fluid resuscitation, vasopressors if needed, antibiotics once cultures were drawn. Sterling rattled off orders to the other nurses, competent and crisp. He was good at this. He was always good at this. What he wasn't good at was seeing when someone else might be better. At 0:34, Hannah pulled up the patient's lab work. The sepsis markers were elevated: white count 18,200, lactate for 0.8, C-reactive protein off the charts. But there was something else in the blood work, something that didn't fit the standard picture. The kind of something that only mattered if you'd seen it before, if you'd learned to read the body's signals like the body was speaking a language that only experience could teach you. She walked to where Sterling stood, reviewing charts. Her hands felt steady. Her breathing was even. She'd practiced this kind of conversation for 3 years: how to suggest without threatening, how to offer without presuming. "Doctor, I wanted to mention, I read something in a recent journal article about sepsis protocols that might be worth considering. About the possibility of organ-specific complications in cases where initial presentation masks underlying." Clark. His voice cut through hers like a scalpel through tissue. He turned to face her, and his expression was the one she'd learned to recognize. The expression that meant she'd made a mistake. "Are you questioning my diagnosis?" "No, doctor. I'm just..." "Because I've been practicing medicine for 22 years. I have my medical degree from Johns Hopkins. And I don't need a nurse with a GED to second-guess my clinical decisions based on something she had read in a journal." His voice had gotten louder. Other nurses were starting to look over. "If you want to practice medicine, Clark, go to medical school. Until then, I suggest you remember the limitations of your position." Hannah stood there. Let the words land. Let them sit in the space between them while the monitor behind them beeped its steady rhythm. In her old life, she would have responded. Would have said something that would have made it clear exactly how much experience she had, exactly what she'd managed to accomplish under circumstances that would have destroyed most people. But that life was supposed to be over. That life was the reason she wore borrowed competence like a disguise and kept her combat boots hidden beneath polyester scrubs. One measured breath. That was what she allowed herself. "Of course, doctor," she said quietly. "I apologize for overstepping." She turned back to the medication cart. Behind her, she heard Sterling speaking to one of the other nurses, something about how important it was to maintain proper hierarchy, to keep people in their lanes, to remember that medicine wasn't a democracy. His voice had the satisfied tone of someone who'd reminded the world of the correct order of things. Hannah pulled up Commander Webb's chart again. Looked at those lab values. Looked at his face, unconscious and vulnerable, the face of a man who'd made decisions under fire that saved 17 Marines in Kandahar because he was the kind of officer who understood that leadership meant knowing when to listen to people nobody else was paying attention to. And she understood, in that moment, what she was going to do. The patient's wife gripped the metal railing of the bed, her knuckles pale against the chrome. Their daughter stood at the foot, watching the monitors with the fixed stare of someone waiting for numbers to mean salvation. Hannah had been adjusting the 4-drip, a simple task, routine, invisible, when Dr. Sterling rounded the corner with the kind of authority that made the hallway shrink around him. "Mrs. Webb," he said, his voice dropping into the register he reserved for families. "Your husband's condition is stable, but I want to address a concern." He turned to Hannah, and the temperature in the room shifted. "Our nursing staff occasionally offers suggestions outside their training. Well-intentioned, of course, but potentially dangerous." Hannah's hand stilled on the drip. She kept her eyes on the fall line, on the steady flow of saline that had nothing to do with what was about to happen. "This morning, one of our nurses recommended we use a sepsis protocol that isn't standard care at Sacred Heart. Suggested it based on," he paused, a slight smile crossing his face, "let's call it intuition." The word landed like a brick. Nurses who overstep cause medical errors. Preventable deaths. I'm sure you understand why we need to maintain proper chain of command in critical care. Mrs. Webb's eyes moved to Hannah, then back to Sterling. The daughter's expression shifted, confusion mixing with concern, the kind that seeps into family conversations later. "This is my responsibility," Sterling continued, addressing the room but watching Hannah's hands. "To make sure protocols are followed. To protect patients from well-meaning staff who forget their scope of practice." Hannah finished securing the 4. Her hands moved with practiced steadiness, each motion precise. No tremor. No hesitation. She exhaled once, a measured breath that emptied her lungs completely, then turned from the bed. She did not make eye contact with the family. She did not acknowledge Sterling's words. She simply moved toward the door like someone who had heard nothing worth responding to. "Nurse Clark," Sterling said, and his tone suggested she should turn back. She did not. "I'll need you to stop by the unit bulletin board before your next shift." The break room smelled of old coffee and the particular staleness of institutional fluorescent lights buzzing their endless electric song. Hannah sat at the small round table in the corner, a cup of decaf cooling in front of her, the weak offering she allowed herself when exhaustion threatened to slip her composure. Around her, the night shift scattered. A respiratory therapist at the coffee station. 2 phlebotomists reviewing lab orders by the window. A resident slumped in a chair, eyes closed, stealing 3 minutes of rest before the next admission. Hannah waited. She had known this was coming. When Dr. Sterling entered, the room's entire atmosphere changed, not because of anything he did, but because of what people assumed they should do. The respiratory therapist stood. The phlebotomists exchanged a glance and began gathering their things. The resident opened his eyes, assessed the situation, and rose without a word. One by one, they filed out. Not a single person looked at Hannah. The exit was synchronized, choreographed with the kind of precision that only happened when people understood the rules of hierarchy and chose to enforce them. The door closed. Hannah sat alone at the table, her coffee still steaming. Sterling did not enter the break room. He did not need to. The message had been sent in 3 minutes of orchestrated silence, a silence far louder than anything he could have said. Hannah understood it completely. She had seen this dance before, in different uniforms, different circumstances. The exile. The way institutions protected themselves by turning visibility into threat. She lifted the cup and drank the cold coffee without flinching. 20 minutes later, she walked to the unit bulletin board. The write-up was printed and posted where every staff member, every visitor, every family member would see it. Performance review notice. Exceeding scope of practice. An entry marked with Sterling's signature and a date. Beneath it, his comments, staff member made clinical recommendations outside nursing authority. Concerning pattern of behavior. Recommend monitoring for signs of instability. Recommend fitness for duty evaluation. The last line was the one that would sting if she let it. She did not. Hannah read it once, absorbing each word without reaction. Her face remained composed. Her breathing steady. She had learned years ago that the body's involuntary responses, the flush, the tremor, the need to defend, could be overridden by will alone. The will to survive. The will to endure. the will to not give someone like Sterling the satisfaction of seeing her break. She reached up and unclipped the notice from the board, folded it once, and slipped it into her pocket. Dr. Sterling appeared at the far end of the hallway, watching her. Waiting to see her reaction. Waiting to see if the performance review would accomplish what the public humiliation had not, the breaking of her composure. The visible crack that would justify whatever he decided to do next. Hannah turned to face him directly. Their eyes met across 30 feet of polished tile. She wiped a single tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, not in surrender, but in the removal of a physical fact that had nothing to do with emotion. Her voice, when it came, was lower than before. Quieter. The kind of quiet that carried weight. "My only concern is that patient's survival, doctor," she said. "I'm sorry if competence makes you uncomfortable." She did not wait for his response. She walked past him toward the medication station, her shoulders level, her gait the same unhurried stride it had always been. But something had shifted in her carriage. Something that had nothing to do with the words she'd spoken and everything to do with the choice she'd just made. She had stopped being invisible. At 2:06 a.m., the alarm came through the overhead system. Code blue, ICU Bay 4. Cardiac tamponade. The words hit like a physical shock, the patient's chest suddenly filling with blood his damaged heart could not push. Commander Marcus Webb. The man whose face she had recognized. The man whose unit had protected her son in Kandahar. Hannah moved before the conscious part of her mind could catch up. Her legs carried her toward the ICU with a speed that made her shoes snap against the tile, snap, 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 each footfall a metronome of purpose. Dr. Sterling was already at the bedside, flanked by 2 residents and a cardiology fellow. The machine screamed their protest. Numbers falling. Oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. The monitor showing the kind of rhythm that meant only one thing: they were running out of time. "We need a needle decompression," one resident said. "It's already been tried," Sterling snapped. "Get me the crash cart. We're taking him to the OR." But the crash cart would take 6 minutes. The OR would take 12. The patient would have 4, maybe 5 before the pressure around his heart became fatal. Hannah saw it in the same way she had learned to see things in another lifetime, under a different sky, when her hands had worked in darkness lit by emergency lanterns and small fires. She saw it in the space between one breath and the next, the specific pressure point, the exact angle, the kind of knowledge that lived in muscle memory rather than conscious thought. The flatline beep cut through everything, a sound like a mortar blast echoing through a concrete corridor. Dust. Desert dust mixing with the antiseptic smell. Sand in her bootlaces. Blood on sand instead of blood on tile. The radio crackled somewhere behind the rotor wash of a helicopter and she blinked. The desert was gone. Hannah grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath from the crash cart. Her hands moved like they had done this 1,000 times. Because they had. Not in this hospital. Not under these lights. But the principle was identical: find the pericardial sac, release the pressure, save the heart before it stopped beating altogether. She did not ask permission. She did not announce what she was doing. She simply moved to the bedside and found the 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line, and drove the needle home. The hiss of air escaping. Suddenly, the pressure released. The monitor stuttered, then found rhythm. Sinus rhythm. The numbers began climbing. Oxygen saturation rising from the basement, 54, 62, 78, 86, climbing toward the number that meant survival. Dr. Sterling's face had gone pale. His hands hung at his sides like someone had forgotten to tell them what to do. "Get a surgical kit," he said, his voice thin. "We need to." "Already placed," Hannah said. She was drawing fluid from the pericardial sac now, 200 cubic centimeters of blood that had been killing the man who had once called her son one of the finest Marines I've ever served with. She withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. The numbers continued climbing. The rhythm held. The patient's eyes opened. Not all the way. Just enough to focus on the face above him. Just enough to recognize her. His lips moved, dry and barely coherent, and formed a single word. Scalpel, he whispered. It was not her rank. It was not her name. It was something older than both. Something from another place. Another time. Something only a handful of people in the world had ever called her. Sterling was frozen. The resident stared. The cardiology fellow was checking the numbers like they might have made an error. Get him to the OR, Hannah said. Her voice had dropped another octave. Not a request. A command. He needs pericardial drainage. 20 minutes, and I want labs. The residents moved. They moved fast. Because whatever had just happened in that bay had rewritten the hierarchy in ways that Sterling had spent 3 years constructing. And none of them were quite sure what they had just witnessed, only that something fundamental had shifted beneath their feet. Hannah stepped back from the bed. She was breathing normally. Her heart rate was steady. But her hands, which she kept at her sides where no one would see them, were not trembling from fear or adrenaline. They were absolutely still. The kind of still that came from knowing exactly how close death had been and how completely she had just prevented it. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the part that would matter in 12 hours when her world was going to collapse in ways she could not yet imagine. The monitor flatlined at 2:06 a.m. Commander Marcus Webb's heart had simply stopped, not the gentle decline of a failing organ, but the sudden catastrophic collapse of a pericardial sac drowning in its own fluid. The ICU went white-hot with activity. 2 residents converged on the bed, one cursing softly, the other reaching for the crash cart with the grim efficiency of someone who already knew this patient wasn't walking out of this room. Cardiac tamponade, one of them said. Not a question. A funeral announcement. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, took one long look at the flat line snaking across the monitor, and turned to the commander's family huddled in the corner. We're going to do everything we can, he said, which was hospital language for goodbye. His hands stayed in his pockets. His posture shifted toward the door, the subtle angle of a man preparing to leave. But I'll be honest. With his sepsis load, his renal failure, his declining trajectory, we may be looking at a natural endpoint here. Natural endpoint. Hannah had been running fluids through a secondary line, checking the Swan-Ganz catheter readings, monitoring the pressures that told the story of a body turning against itself. She heard Sterling's words. Heard the note of resignation in his voice, the professional courtesy of permission being granted to stop trying. Heard the family's breathing change, the quick intake of air that meant they understood what he wasn't quite saying. She didn't stop moving. The crash cart arrived with its freight of controlled panic, AED pads, defibrillator paddles, the organized chaos of a team that had drilled this sequence 1,000 times. One resident started compressions. The other was already drawing up epinephrine, muscle memory playing out on muscle memory. CPR for a man who was already failing. Shock for a heart that couldn't be shocked back into a rhythm it had abandoned. Hannah watched the pressures drop further. Watched the O2 sat plummet. And then something shifted in her chest, not fear. Something older. Something that recognized this pattern from a place she'd spent 2 years trying to forget. The sandstorm outside Kandahar had turned day into absolute black. The FOBS trauma bay had been lit by nothing but the emergency strips along the floor and the headlamps on the surgical team. She'd been standing at the table then too, hand steady over a Marine's chest cavity, her voice calling out numbers while rounds impacted the concrete walls outside. The blackout had been total. The casualties had been endless. The protocol had been simple, save who you can save. Move fast. Don't think. Let your hands remember what your mind couldn't hold. Pain was data. Pressure was information. Shock meant you were doing something right. Hannah moved toward the bed. Pericardiocentesis, she said. Not a suggestion. The voice that came out wasn't the one she'd been using for 3 years, the one that asked permission and deferred to hierarchy. This voice was flat. Certain. The voice of someone who had spent 247 surgical emergencies learning what worked when everything else was failing. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. We're losing him to fluid. 20 more seconds and he's not coming back. One of the residents looked at her. The other didn't break rhythm on the compressions. Sterling was still in the doorway. His blood pressure is 70/40. His lactate is 12.3. Prognosis is not your call, Hannah said. She was already moving toward the supply cart, fingers finding what they needed without looking. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Syringe. The exact angle and confidence of someone who had done this before. Who had done this in the dark. Who had done this while the world was exploding. Nurse Clark, step back from that patient. That's an order. She didn't step back. She couldn't step back. Not because of Sterling. Because of the man on the table whose heart had stopped and whose family was standing in the corner believing he was already gone. Because she recognized the shape of surrender when she saw it, and she'd spent 2 years running from surrender. Her hands moved on their own. The needle slid into the chest at the correct angle, not too steep, not too shallow. The sensation of the needle breaking through tissue, through the pericardial membrane, the sudden give when it entered the fluid-filled sac. She could feel it through her fingertips. Could feel the exact moment of contact. The syringe drew back and the barrel filled with dark blood, 200 ccs of the fluid that had been suffocating the heart. The hiss of pressure releasing. The monitor beeped once. Irregular. Then again. Stronger. The flat line broke into fragmented rhythm. Sinus, almost. Almost sinus rhythm. O2 sac climbing, one of the residents said. 71. 74. 79. Sterling was pounding on the glass partition between the trauma bay and the observation room. His voice was muffled but the meaning was clear. She was overstepping, exceeding scope, doing something that only physicians were authorized to do. But the monitor was climbing. The pressures were normalizing. The numbers didn't care about Sterling's authority. They only cared about fluid and oxygen and the difference between dead and alive. 85, the resident continued. 88. 90. 92. Stable. The commander's chest rose and fell. His O2 saturation held steady at 92%. His heart was beating. Not strong yet, but beating. Beating meant salvageable. Beating meant second chances. Sterling had stopped pounding. He was standing at the glass with his hands at his sides. His face had gone the color of old piano keys, all the white drained out of it, all the authority with it. Hannah finished the procedure with the same steady hands that had held them steady in sandstorms and blackouts and in the dark corners of an ICU in Norfolk, Virginia. She didn't look at Sterling. She didn't acknowledge the residents who were staring at her with expressions that suggested they were trying to solve an equation that didn't have numbers for. She simply finished the work. Cleaned up the tray. Made sure the needle was disposed of, the fluid was documented, the patient was stable. Only then did she look up. Sterling was gone from the glass. The commander's monitor continued its steady electronic rhythm. His wife was crying into her hands, not the sounds of grief anymore, but the sounds of someone who had been given back what she thought she'd already lost. His daughter had moved to the edge of the bed, and hovering above his arm like she was afraid to touch him and break whatever miracle had just happened. Hannah stepped back from the stretcher and peeled off her gloves. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. The adrenaline that had flooded her system belonged to a version of her that knew how to be calm in the center of crisis, and that version didn't need to fall apart once the crisis was over. That came later. But that wasn't the next part. The next part was morning shift arriving and finding Commander Marcus Webb conscious. The next part was him asking for her name and her trying to leave before he could answer. The next part was him whispering a single word when the day nurse mentioned Hannah's name, a word so quiet only Hannah heard it, a word that meant he recognized her, that meant he knew something about her that she'd spent 2 years burying in a box of worn boots at the bottom of a hospital locker. A word that changed everything. By 0800 that morning, Dr. Sterling had already activated his network. 3 phone calls to board members who owed him referrals, each conversation calibrated, each favor cashed in. They didn't need details. They just needed to know that someone in the ICU was overstepping, that there were concerns about judgment, about stability. The words were precise. I'm not saying she's unstable. I'm just saying the board should be aware. At 0847, he contacted Hannah's nursing school references. Not with accusations. With questions. Soft, poisonous questions. Have you ever noticed any lapses in her judgment? Any concerning behaviors during her training? The kind of inquiry that plants doubt even when the answer is a firm no. The kind of call that makes people hesitant to recommend someone they've never had a problem with. By 0920, an outside hospital investigator had been brought in, a woman Sterling had worked with before, the kind who understood that her role was to find violations, not exonerate people. She spent 2 hours with Hannah's employment file. 8 years of spotless performance. Night shift. Never called in sick. Never complained. Quiet. Invisible. Perfect. Until the pericardiocentesis. Hannah didn't know any of this was happening. She was still in the ICU at 1015, charting notes, checking the commander's vitals, watching his oxygen saturation hold steady at 96%. The man who had saved her son's life was breathing. His heart was beating in normal sinus rhythm. That was all that mattered. That was her job. That was done. The call came at 11:25. To her supervisor's office. Not a conversation. A summons. Sterling was waiting when she arrived, the investigator beside him, a clipboard held like a weapon. The supervisor, James Chen, who had always been kind to her, looked at his desk instead of at her face. We've completed a preliminary review, Sterling said, his voice smooth as oil on water. And there are serious concerns about your scope of practice. Emergency procedures are physician-directed. You performed an intervention without authorization. The patient was in cardiac arrest, Hannah said. Her voice was level. No one was directing anything. Someone had to act. Exactly. Sterling turned to the investigator. That's exactly the problem. The investigator didn't look up from her notes. You're suspended pending a full board review. Security will escort you from the building. You'll surrender your badge and access cards. Hannah felt the words land the way she'd learned to absorb body blows in the field, take the impact, distribute the force, don't let anyone see you break. One measured breath. Then another. Understood, she said. She walked to her locker at 11:55. Opened the door to the small space where she'd kept a spare uniform, some energy bars, and at the very bottom, the pair of worn combat boots she'd never quite been able to throw away. Size 7 women's, navy issued, the heel scuffed, the leather salt-stained from sweat and dust. She'd grabbed them without thinking, just reaching for something real, something that hadn't changed. Security was waiting. Not threatening. Just present. 2 officers in dark uniforms, one of them holding a cardboard box. Your personal items, the officer said. Not unkindly. She placed the boots in the box. The energy bars. A photograph of her son in his dress uniform. A card from the staff from her 3-year anniversary. She closed the box. Taped it. Didn't cry. Not in front of them. Not here. The officer walked with her to the exit. Down the corridor she'd walked 10,000 times. Past the break room where nurses were eating lunch, she saw them notice her, see the box, and deliberately turn away, the kind of synchronized silence that meant Sterling had already explained what needed explaining. The kind of abandonment that came from people who'd learned not to question authority. The rain had started while she was inside. Fat drops that hit the pavement in sheets, turning the parking lot into a mirror of grey sky. Hannah stood with the cardboard box in her hands for a moment, letting the rain soak through her scrubs, feeling the cold work its way down to her skin. She sat in her car for 6 minutes. Not crying. Just breathing. Her hands on the steering wheel, steady. Her eyes fixed on nothing. Then she drove home. Her apartment was small. A studio in a converted colonial on the edge of Norfolk, the kind of place no one would ever think to look for a decorated officer. No photographs on the walls. No medals. No evidence of anything except a quiet woman with a quiet life. She sat at the kitchen table with the cardboard box in front of her at exactly 14:30 when she heard the key in the lock. Her son's shift at the naval base wasn't supposed to end until 1700. But there he was, stepping through the door in his Navy work uniform, khaki blouse and trousers, his name tape perfectly centered. He's bearing that particular military straight spine that came from knowing how to stand at attention even when you were standing still. He stopped moving when he saw her. Saw the box. Saw her in civilian clothes at 14:30 on a workday. Mom. His voice cracked on the single syllable. She couldn't explain. The words were there but they wouldn't come out in the right order. She'd told him she worked at a clinic across town. A small walk-in facility. Nothing important. Nothing worth talking about. And now here was the evidence that she'd lied, that her job, her entire constructed identity of normalcy, had collapsed so thoroughly that someone had put it in a box. I was fired, Hannah said. Simple. True. Incomplete. Why? What happened? You never said anything was. He sat down at the table, his training momentarily abandoning him, leaving just a young man trying to understand why his mother was crying. Mom, what did you do? She couldn't answer because the real answer would require her to explain where she'd been for the last 2 years. Why she'd vanished from her previous life. Why she'd chosen a hospital no one knew about in a city where she had no connections. Why she'd taught herself to be invisible. Hannah stood and walked to the bedroom. The closet where she kept the essentials. She pulled the cardboard box closer and opened it, reaching down to the bottom where the combat boots were sitting, still wet from the rain, the leather darkening as it absorbed water. She pulled them out and stared at them like they were photographs from another woman's life. Size 7 women's, Navy issued, the heel scuffed, the leather salt-stained not from sweat and dust anymore, but from rain. She held them in her hands and thought about cowardice. About whether running from the nightmares and the flashbacks and the weight of 247 emergency surgeries had been the right choice. Whether the fragile piece she'd built, this quiet civilian life, was worth the lie she'd had to tell to maintain it. Whether she could go back. Whether she should. The boots felt impossibly heavy. Her son appeared in the doorway. Mom. She didn't answer. Couldn't. She was still holding the boots, still standing in the middle of her bedroom, still trying to decide if disappearing 2 years ago had saved her or just postponed the inevitable. And then her phone rang. The sound came from downstairs, from the kitchen counter where she'd left it. Not a text. An actual call. She'd set it to silent months ago, had trained herself not to react to notifications, not to engage. The phone rang again. And again. Hannah set the boots down slowly, carefully, on the bed beside her. She walked downstairs with her son following, watched him watching her with confusion and worry spreading across his face like he was trying to solve an equation that didn't have an answer. She picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was crisp, authoritative, not asking but announcing, Senior Chief Clark, this is Naval District Norfolk Command. We need to see you immediately. A vehicle will be at your location in 4 minutes. The line went dead. Hannah looked at her son. Looked at the phone in her hand. Looked at the cardboard box sitting on her kitchen table like evidence of everything she'd tried to leave behind. She took one measured breath. Son, I need to tell you something, she said, her voice dropping an octave, shedding the quiet accent of the woman in scrubs and returning to the voice of someone who had commanded field operations in sandstorm blackouts. "My name is Hannah Clark. Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. And I need you to understand what's about to happen very, very quickly." Outside, the rain hammered the windows. The distant sound of helicopter rotors began to vibrate through the air, growing louder, closer, a sound that belonged to a life she'd been trying to bury. But the boots were still on her bed upstairs, waiting. The helicopter rotors grew louder, shaking the kitchen windows. Hannah's son stood frozen, his uniform suddenly making sense, the calls he took from other officers, the discipline, the weight he carried home on his shoulders. He looked at his mother sitting at the table with her combat boots in her lap, and his voice dropped to the careful tone he used when negotiating with his own people. "Mom. What are you?" She didn't answer. Couldn't. The rotors were almost directly overhead now, the sound pressing down on the house like a fist. Her son walked to the front window and looked up. "That's a UH-60M. That's not a civilian bird. That's not even regular Navy." He turned back to her, and for the first time in 2 years, she saw recognition in his face, not confusion, but the cold clarity of someone who had just solved a puzzle he didn't want to solve. "Who called them?" The helicopter banked hard over the neighborhood. Down the street, she could see rotors stabilizing over the naval base 7 blocks away. Her son's radio crackled. He didn't answer it. He was looking at his mother the way a subordinate looks at someone who outranks them. The way people look when they realize they've been sitting across from a ghost the entire time. "Pack a bag," he said quietly. "If Naval District Command is deploying a bird at 1,506 hours for a civilian address, this isn't about a nursing job." The board hearing convened at 0900 the next morning in the Sacred Heart administrative offices on the 4th floor. Hannah sat across from 7 board members in suits, with her union representative, a tired woman named Patricia who'd already lost 2 similar cases to Sterling's institutional network. The hospital director, a man named Castellano with the soft eyes of someone who'd learned to look away, opened a file. "We're here to discuss the circumstances of your employment termination on grounds of exceeding scope of practice and patient endangerment." Sterling sat to the director's right, his expression composed. His suit was pressed. His hands were folded. He looked like a man who had already won. Then the ICU charge nurse appeared in the doorway, breathless. "Director Castellano. The commander. He's awake. He's been asking for," she glanced at Hannah. "He's asking for the nurse. From 2 nights ago." The room shifted. Sterling's fold tightened. Castellano stood. "We'll reconvene after we." "No." The voice came from the doorway, and it belonged to a SEAL liaison officer in dress blues with a collar of decorations. Behind him were 2 more in Navy service dress, they're bearing the kind that made every person in the room feel smaller. The SEAL stepped forward with the casual authority of someone accustomed to taking command of any space he entered. "The hearing doesn't pause. The Admiral is in the ICU and he wants this resolved before he's discharged. So we listen now, or I make a phone call and this hearing becomes a federal investigation instead of an HR matter. Your choice, Director." Castellano's face had gone the color of old parchment. He sat back down. The SEAL nodded to Hannah's son, who stood from the back corner where he'd been standing in dress uniform since 0730. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clark. 12-year career. 3 combat deployments. Kandahar, 2011 to 2013. Field Surgeon Rotation, attached to 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. His voice cracked exactly once. "Mom, tell them. Tell them what you did there." Hannah felt the room turn toward her. Patricia reached over and gripped her arm. Sterling's hands had uncurled. His fingers spread flat against the table like he was testing its solidity. Hannah opened the medical file for Commander Webb. Her hands were steady. 247 emergency surgeries over 22 months. Compound fractures, traumatic amputations, penetrating torso wounds, hemorrhagic shock. She paused. Met Sterling's eyes. I worked under fire. I made decisions in darkness with no surgical team, no pharmacy backup, no time. I made them right more often than I made them wrong. That's how I kept Marines alive. Sterling's face had begun to drain of color. The first layer of his armor was cracking. The SEAL stepped forward. His voice flattened into the register of someone reading an official record. 2 bronze stars for Valor. 1 Purple Heart from an IED fragmentation wound to the left calf. 2nd Purple Heart from mortar shrapnel. He paused. Let each decoration settle into the silence like stones. Combat Action Ribbon. And a classified commendation for a compound evacuation in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, where Senior Chief Clark was the last medical officer standing and extracted 17 Marines under active fire with 0 casualties. Sterling's hands had begun to shake. She was also, the SEAL continued, his eyes never leaving Sterling's face, recommended for a Navy Cross. Twice. The paperwork was declined because the classified nature of the operation required her identity remain compartmentalized. Command thought it was safer for her to disappear. She thought so too. He looked at Hannah. Didn't you? After you woke up screaming. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Hannah nodded once. The SEAL's voice dropped lower. 3 board members in this room have security clearances high enough to verify what I'm about to tell you. Director Castellano, you're not one of them. So you're about to make a choice. He turned to face Sterling directly. Dr. Sterling. You called for references. You contacted board members. You brought in an outside investigator to build a file on this woman. You did this because she challenged your authority over a patient. Sterling tried to speak. Nothing came. That patient, the SEAL continued, is Commander Marcus Webb, United States Marine Corps. Rank equivalent to Senior Chief Petty Officer Clark. He was assigned under her medical authority for 18 months in 2012. When he coded Tuesday at 0206, she performed an emergency pericardiocentesis that saved his life using a technique that 98% of Navy doctors wouldn't attempt without an ultrasound. He woke up and whispered her call sign. Then he made a phone call. Sterling stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. It clattered on the floor like a period at the end of a sentence. This is a witch hunt. This is retaliation. I have documentation of her instability, her concerning behavior, her overreach. Sit down, Doctor, the SEAL said. Not loud. Not angry. Just a command. Sterling Saturday. The door opened. The same security guard who'd escorted Hannah out with a cardboard box 24 hours earlier walked in carrying an identical box. He set it down beside Sterling's chair. Dr. Sterling, I believe you know the way out. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at Director Castellano, whose face had the slack expression of someone watching his career evaporate in real time. The guard didn't move. Sterling grabbed the box and stood again, and this time nobody moved to stop him. He walked to the door. Paused. Looked back at Hannah as if to say something. Then he kept walking. The hearing lasted another 8 minutes. The board voted unanimously to overturn the termination, reinstate all back pay, and remove the write-up from her record. Patricia squeezed her arm. Hannah's son was staring at his mother like he was meeting her for the first time. The SEAL nodded once. Welcome back, Senior Chief. 6 months later, her son sent her a photograph. He'd taken it without explanation, just included it in a text message with no caption. The photo showed a man at a folding table outside a strip mall urgent care in Tucson, Arizona. Above the table hung a banner that read Sterling Care Insurance Solutions. The man was wearing a polo shirt with a name tag. The name tag read Steve. His face had the peculiar hollowness of someone who'd survived catastrophe but would never recover from it. He was smiling at a customer while taking their credit card information. His hands were trembling slightly. Hannah printed the photo and set it on her desk next to her combat boots. The boots were in her new office at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Norfolk, where Commander Webb had personally requested her as Director of Emergency Psychiatric Services and Trauma Response. The office had large windows overlooking the James River. There was a nameplate on the door that read Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clark, RN, Director. She wore her rank on her sleeve now. On the day of her first staff meeting, the entire department stood when she entered. Nobody sat until she did. She didn't ask for it, it was the protocol of a woman who'd been promoted to authority by the very people who mattered most. One of her nurses was a young woman named Rivera, fresh out of Bethesda Naval Hospital, barely 23 years old, with the kind of intensity that came from watching your mentors survive things that shouldn't be survivable. One afternoon, Rivera hesitated before asking a question. Hannah saw it and said, "Speak." "That's an order." "Senior Chief, did it get easier? After what you went through?" Hannah was about to answer the clinical truth, that PTSD never really goes away, it just becomes manageable. Instead, she found herself thinking about the 2 years she'd spent invisible. About Dr. Sterling's hand shaking as his career imploded. About her son's face when he realized his mother had been saving lives all along. "No," Hannah said finally. "It gets different. The fear becomes structure. The grief becomes focus. And one day you realize you've been teaching the people around you how to survive, and they're learning." She paused. "That part gets easier." That evening, Hannah was checking vitals on a patient in the trauma wing when a man walked past her station. He did a double take. It was the other security guard, not the one who'd handed the boxes, but the one who'd escorted Hannah out. He was there visiting his nephew. When their eyes met, he nodded with the slow acknowledgement of someone who'd been part of something larger than himself. Hannah nodded back. Some stories don't need words. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The facility had been reformed by federal mandate, a new veteran psychiatric wing, weekly trauma counseling staff, a $4 million donation from an anonymous source that everyone knew came from Commander Webb's family. The hospital that had tried to erase her was now teaching residents from her curriculum. Irony was a kind of poetry when it moved slowly enough to see clearly. One morning, as Hannah was reviewing treatment protocols, her phone buzzed. A text from her son, "Mom. You're coming to dinner Sunday. No excuses. Dad wants to meet the real version of you." She almost smiled. Almost. The composure held, but just barely. She typed back, "What time?" The answer came in seconds, 1800. "And wear your uniform. Just this once." Hannah looked at the photograph of Dr. Sterling on her desk, then at the combat boots beside it. She thought about the difference between hiding and healing, between power and the refusal to use it on people who didn't deserve it. She thought about Commander Webb waking up in the ICU and recognizing the truth before anyone else did. She thought about her son standing in front of a hospital board and claiming his mother back from the ghost she'd become. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, share this story. If you've ever hidden who you really were to survive, and then found the courage to stop, leave a comment below. Subscribe so you never miss a story about the quiet heroes among us.